When talking about the best transformations and mutations of people and monsters in Resident Evil, we have an absolute embarrassment of riches. Every game in the series is brimming with either scenes that show those transformations as they're happening, or with their aftermaths to show what those who underwent that transformation now look like. And sure, not all of them are winners, and I'm looking at you, T-Rex Simmons, but by and large, they turn out pretty damn great. Here, we're going to highlight a few of them. Warning, there are spoilers ahead for all Resident Evil games. Before we go ahead, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos every single day, and your support really helps us out. With that out of the way, let's start. Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Nemesis may have been a bit of a disappointment as a stalker enemy in the Resident Evil 3 Remake, but credit where credit is due. The game did put him in plenty of excellent boss fights. He takes multiple forms throughout the game, growing more mutated and monstrous each time, and his final form in the game's last boss fight in Nest 2 is absolutely disgusting, in the best way possible. Unbelievably massive, oozing biomass everywhere, multiple massive claws sticking out of the whole body. Yeah, it's a glorious, horrifying mess. William Birkin, Resident Evil 2 Remake. The tragic yet well-deserved downfall of William Birkin is central to the story of Resident Evil 2 and in the remake. The multiple transformations that he goes throughout the course of the game slowly change him from human to complete monster. His final form when Claire and Leon are on the train is a far cry from his human form, but his best stage as a G-monster is easily the form before that. With 4 massive claws sticking out of his back, a bunch of yellow eyeballs on his chest, and enough strength and agility to rip a man in half in the blink of an eye, is truly a terrifying foe. Crimson Heads, Resident Evil Remake. A quick look at a crimson head might lead you to believe that these things are not nearly threatening enough, certainly not as much as some of the other creatures mentioned in this feature, but don't be fooled. Introduced in the original RE remake, leave a dead zombie unburnt or with its head intact for too long, and it'll eventually rise again, this time much faster, ferocious, and stronger. It's such a simple idea, but it was used to excellent effect in the game, ensuring that you were always on your toes, even when heading into areas you thought you'd previously cleared. Super Tyrant, Resident Evil 2 Remake. Mr. X's shadow looms large over all of Resident Evil 2, so it makes sense that he takes on the final form that he does for the climactic confrontation against him in the game, in the remake more specifically. Though not nearly as dramatic of a transformation as some of the others in this feature, his hulking figure becomes even more imposing, while his right arm mutates into a deadly claw, which he uses with precision in his attempts to send you to a quick and painful death. Albert Wesker, Resident Evil 5. Charting Albert Wesker's history throughout Resident Evil is a long and eventful exercise, but when you're at the end, you're in for an absolute treat. All of his years of pulling the strings and sowing chaos come to fruition when his own creation, the Ouroboros virus, transforms him into something much more blatantly monstrous. Though he retains his human form, he uses the 2 massive writhing arms popping out of his torso to great effect as he takes on Chris and Sheva inside of a volcano in a duel for the ages. Eveline, Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7's final boss is pretty disappointing as a boss fight, but the visual design for Eveline is worth every plaudit. Eveline's transformation from little girl to old woman in a wheelchair is creepy enough as it is, but what's even more fascinating to witness is her absorbing all of the molded in the Baker estate to essentially transform herself into the entire house. Talk about escalation. BITORES MENDEZ, Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 has no shortage of memorable boss fights, but Chief Mendez is definitely among the best the game has to offer, and his visual design has a big role to play in how good this encounter is. When you see someone who used to be a man mutating so much that his spine elongates and lengthens, pops out multiple tiny appendages in addition to extra arms, and starts moving around like a disgusting spider on 2 legs, well, yeah, something like that's gonna stay with you. Jack Baker, Resident Evil 7. Jack Baker, the man who refuses to die. Time and time again, Ethan Winters comes up against him in Resident Evil 7, and each time he seemingly dies, only to come back a little while later, stronger and even mutated beyond recognition. His final form in the base game, where he's essentially transformed into a mess of mold and eyeballs as high as a room's ceiling, is completely unrecognizable from the man that he used to be. Typically, even though Ethan manages to defeat him, he still doesn't die. Jack Baker, Swamp Man, Resident Evil 7, End of Zoe. Following his many fights with Ethan in RE7's base game, Jack Baker comes back in the End of Zoe DLC, this time as the terrifying Swamp Man. That also turns out to be Jack's final form as a bioweapon, owing to the fact that his brother Joe punches him to death, for good this time. And it's a fitting end to an amazing character too. The Swamp Man is a formidable foe, to say the very least, both as an enemy and in terms of visual design. Jack Norman, Resident Evil Revelations. Whether or not Jack Norman is a good character and an interesting villain is very much up for debate. He's not the best, but there's little doubt that the final fight against him in Revelations is one of the game's better bits. The visual design for Norman's final form deserves huge props for that. On the surface, he looks a lot like a tyrant, with his imposing muscular body and his massive claw arm, while his unique abilities also ensure that he's far from a pushover. Sure, he's no William Birkin, but on its own merits, this is a pretty cool transformation. Neil Fisher, Resident Evil Revelations 2. When a dude who looks like a regular executive ends his arc as a massive monster with spikes and tentacles that can throw a human across a room like they're a pebble, and who can jump up several feet into the air with zero effort, you know he's gone through a pretty dramatic mutation. Neil Fisher's treachery ensured that he was never going to have a happy ending, nor should he have, but seeing his intense transformation was truly a sight to behold. Alex Wesker, Resident Evil Revelations 2. Possibly one of the best mutations in Resident Evil in recent years, not just in terms of visual design, but also because of its implications. Transformed by her own T-Phobos virus, Alex Wesker's fear of dying turns her into a monstrous beast that'll chill you to the bone the moment you look at it, thanks to everything from the way she moves to her moans of agony. The fact that she essentially exists as two warring consciousnesses inside of this monster makes the mutation that much more disturbing. PIERS NIVANS, Resident Evil 6. PIERS may be the only protagonist on this list, but he definitely deserves to be here. Say what you will about RE6, but his character arc was definitely one of the game's highlights. Seeing him sacrifice himself and injecting himself with the C virus to use its effects to help Chris defeat House was an excellent moment. From a massive trident-like appendage to being able to discharge bioelectricity, PIERS develops the effects of the C virus quickly, and in his final moments, makes sure to use them for good. Jack KRAUSER, Resident Evil 4. If you looked at an image of Jack KRAUSER's final form without any knowledge of Resident Evil 4 or its story, you'd have no way of knowing that that monster used to be Leon's friend at one time. It's definitely dramatic to say the very least. Heavily mutated by the virus, KRAUSER possesses superhuman strength and the ability to transform one of his arms into a claw. James Marcus, Resident Evil 0. James Marcus is definitely one of Resident Evil's corniest, stupidest villains, but we do have to admit that the final fight against him is pretty cool. Well, technically the fight is against the Queen Leech, but Marcus is still somewhere in there. And the lore explanation of how that comes to pass is what makes this transformation so interesting to us. Taking over the dead scientist's body and absorbing his memories, it believes itself to be James Marcus and proceeds to wreak havoc not only for the stars, but for Umbrella as well. So, what are your thoughts on this? Go ahead and share them in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please subscribe to the channel and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon to get new video updates. We upload every day and would really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.